Viridian, The Green Guide, written by Clouds, read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 19, Progress. Izuku blinked rapidly, half convinced that he was reading the words wrong. A 96% on the entrance exam? How was that even possible? There must have been some mistake, right? Izuku was too dumb to be able to ace the entire entrance exam when he hadn't even had time to do it twice. But there was Izuku's name at the top of the email, clear as day, and the letter had arrived in his inbox, so it must be for him. "Mom!" he yelled so that she could hear him from the kitchen. "Can you come here? I need to make sure I'm reading this right." Mom nearly slid down the hall in her hurry to open his bedroom door. "What is it, Izuku? What's wrong?" Izuku simply leaned back and pointed to the screen. He held his breath as Mom leaned over to read the email. He didn't know what he was even hoping for. He didn't want to get his hopes up because there wasn't any way he'd pass, but if Mom read the same thing he did... "Oh, Izuku!" Mom turned to him with tears in her eyes that were at odds with the brilliant smile on her face. "Congratulations, you got in! I knew you could do it!" Izuku continued staring at the screen in shock as Mom sank to her knees and hugged him. I got in. I got in! Mom chuckled as she hugged him even tighter. "You did! This is going to be so good for you, Izuku. I'll call Aldera first thing in the morning and do the paperwork." "Oh, this calls for a celebration. Do you want to go out?" Izuku shook his head and held up his cast. I don't want to risk running into anyone." Mom's eyes shone in understanding. "How about some ice cream then? I can go pick some up while you register for your classes." Izuku nodded, and Mom smiled and ruffled his hair before she left. Izuku turned back to the email and clicked on the link to sign up for classes. The first step was to make sure he was registered for all the required classes, such as science, math, and literature. Then he had to take one foreign language class, so he ended up registering for English since that was what the school recommended. The problem was that he also had to take 3 elective classes. But Izuku had never really had any hobbies outside of being a hero, which obviously wasn't going to happen. He frowned as he scrolled through his options. Art might be fine. It would help make his notebooks more detailed, if nothing else. So he added that class before he could start to doubt himself. But that still left 2 classes. He was most of the way down the list of electives by the time another class caught his eye. Quirk theory. That could be interesting. Analyzing quirks was one of his favorite parts of watching hero fights, and Eraserhead had mentioned that analyzing villains' quirks would help him fight better, so it wouldn't hurt to learn more about them. But that still left one final elective. He should probably choose something to do with a hobby, but Izuku really didn't have any hobbies outside of being a vigilante, and somehow he didn't think that his new school would let him count that as an elective. Thinking of his vigilantism made Izuku restless. It had been almost a week and a half since he'd gone out, and he was really starting to miss it. His body had gotten used to waking up in the middle of the night, so he was spending a few hours every night just staring at the ceiling and reminding himself that Mom would never forgive him if he somehow managed to re-break his arm, and that if he did, then he'd have to explain how he'd broken it again, and that would just make her worry too much. His only consolation about the whole thing was that he knew that none of the heroes were missing him. In fact, they were probably just grateful that he was staying out of the way. And he knew he was being selfish for wanting to feel useful again, but he just wished there was some way he could still help while he was healing. It would be amazing if he had a quirk that let him see the streets remotely, Then he could just call the heroes and send them to where they were needed. It didn't even have to be a quirk. If he even had some sort of drone he could fly around without being suspicious, or even just some sort of camera. Izuku sat straight up. Security cameras. Why hadn't he thought of that before? They were all over the city, and sure, they didn't cover every alleyway, but they had to be better than nothing. It was probably completely useless, since there was no way that a Deku like him would be able to become good enough at hacking to be able to access the city's security cameras without getting caught. But, well, he needed another elective anyway, and programming would be a good skill for the future. He found a class on programming basics and signed up just as Mom arrived with the ice cream. He knew he shouldn't get his hopes up. It would only hurt that much more when everything went wrong again. Shota was struggling to focus on his investigation. Really, he hadn't known Viridian for that long. So why should he be this affected by the fact that he disappeared? He just disappeared. Shota didn't have any evidence to the contrary, and it was completely illogical to assume the worst possible outcome. But he also didn't want to keep his hopes up, only for the kid to have been dead the whole time. Just like, well, he should be getting back to work. There had been more and more cases of instant villains the last few weeks, and the last time this happened, it had been followed by the next level villains. It was almost as though whoever was behind the villain factory was gauging potential for villains the same way he did for heroes. Which led to the next major mystery. Before his disappearance, Hamasaki had said something about the symbol of evil. The phrase tickled at the back of Shota's brain, like he'd read it somewhere before, but hadn't paid any attention to it. But try as he might, he just couldn't remember the significance of the epitaph. It seemed to have some significance to Tsukachi, but when Shota had pressed him for answers, he'd simply said that it wasn't important. He'd said that it couldn't be the man he thought it was, because that one was already dead and had been for years. Shota just hoped he was imagining the way that Tsukachi had gone pale during the conversation. It was frustrating. The biggest lead they'd ever gotten about the villain factory, and it was a dead end. So, what next? It just wasn't practical to put every single trigger user in protective custody in case the factory started abducting again. So they were on the back foot until the villains made another move. If only they knew what kinds of quirks appealed to the villain factory. Shota knew that it wasn't necessarily strong quirks, because they had a lot of ways to strengthen them artificially. But there didn't seem to be any common denominator in the victims who got abducted and those that didn't. If only the kid were still... Of course, even if he was alive, it wouldn't be fair to bring him into such a dangerous investigation. Even if he was a vigilante, he was still a semi-suicidal teenager who wasn't prepared to deal with the danger that came from investigations like this. But still, the kid had a talent for quirk analysis. He hadn't been able to spend a lot of time with the notebook, but from what he'd read, he had a sneaking suspicion that if anyone could figure out how the villain factory was picking their victims, it was Viridian. If Katsuki didn't know he was the best, he might be tempted to think he was an idiot. Seriously, how hadn't he noticed how messed up Aldera was? Were their teachers secretly villains or something? Because that was kind of the only explanation Katsuki could think of that would explain how they willfully ignored students getting beat up right in front of them. And that wasn't even getting into the verbal bullying that happened right in the middle of class. The teachers didn't ignore that, but Katsuki thought ignoring it would be preferable to what they were doing. They seemed to be actively creating opportunities for the students to make fun of the less popular students, and often joined in the mockery by publicly shaming students for tiny offenses that wouldn't even get Katsuki a sidewise glance. It was messed up. But what was even more messed up was that Katsuki didn't know how to stop it. He was supposed to be the best, but he wasn't about to pretend that he had any sort of moral authority here. He'd bullied Deku and all those other extras for years, so he couldn't just turn around and tell others to stop. Why had he even stopped? It had taken Deku literally saving his life to even get him to lay off the nerd. Not that he'd ever forgive Deku for that, but still. He'd screwed up way too badly to say anything now. The best that he could do was stop acting like a villain. He'd thought it was pretty clever to volunteer at that villain rehabilitation group. Volunteering and shit always looked good on hero school applications, and maybe he'd even be able to learn something or some shit without jeopardizing his clean record. Not that he deserved a clean record, but he needed to be a hero. He wasn't about to let his idiot teachers ruin his chances at being the #1 hero just because they couldn't be bothered to do their freaking jobs. That amplifier lady had sent him home with some paperwork to do, but he'd be attending the next meeting. He'd just have to deal with being in the same room with villains without exploding them on sight. Katsuki glanced over at his teacher, who was correcting essays while fingers scratched at that one kid who could make bubbles. At least he was getting some practice. End of chapter.